But probably with the compliance, certainly with the, what shall we say, silent complicity of the Attorney General. You see, it's having an Attorney General who can't be suspicious of anybody that necessitates having a special prosecutor.
But this has become this is a political issue, not a legal issue.
I didn't interrupt you once.
Yeah, well, please,
not to say that, not to say nothing of the fact that the Attorney General himself necessitates 2 or 3 special prosecutors for his own activities. The fact that he refuses to bring the mentality of an investigator or a cop or a Justice Department official at all to the signs of high crime and misdemeanor in high places means you've got to have special prosecutors to fill the vacancy left by an Attorney General of that type.
Would you be in favor of a special prosecutor to investigate Speaker Jim Wright?
Yes, I would, sure. Yeah.
But who would establish the law?
It seems to me, at any rate, from what I've read.
But as a special prosecutor law now exists, it's a creation of Congress, used exclusively to go after the executive branch. Congress is exempt from special prosecution, and so it's clearly a mechanism for settling political scores, scores which should be settled at the ballot box and not in the courts.
Yeah, but it seems to worry you more than the evidence of criminal activity in the administration worries you. I mean, which is what I suppose I would expect from the American Spectator,
funding an anti-communist cause is not a criminal activity.
What, you mean nothing done in that that cause can be criminal? Is that what you meant to say?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be that absolutist,
well,
but it seems that what causes people most upset is not really the Iran connection, but simply the fact that money was being sent to the Contras privately.
Could I jump in here, and we'll get back to this, I'm sure, as the hour goes on, or the 90 minutes goes on, but I want to ask you about another thing that popped up over the weekend. And not just the weekend, but it seems to track through the last 48 hours. First, let's start, because we're talking about the Iran-Contra thing, with Washington Whispers right up here in this corner, and this is in U.S. News. This buds for Nixon. Before Robert Bud McFarland pleaded guilty last week in connection with the Iran-Contra affair, he visited Richard Nixon, who agreed that McFarland should strike a deal to be sentenced before he had to testify against his old colleagues. I'm going to drop this and show you the New York Times for Monday. And this is another story by Stephen Engelberg. McFarland's struggle with himself and the special prosecutor. Right down here, they have lifted a quote. Nixon describes McFarland's situation as tragic, and many people who know Mr. McFarland express sympathy for him. Mr. Nixon, for instance, said in an interview, "I've known Bud McFarland going back on 20 years. It's tragic for him and for the nation that he had to go through this ordeal." One other thing, and it's Richard Nixon related, in the New York Times yesterday, the front page here is of the New York Times Magazine, Dealing with Gorbachev by Richard Nixon, and it's an article from a forthcoming book that he's about to publish. He's about to make a speech in New York that's open to cameras. Overall general reaction to why Richard Nixon all of a sudden is being quoted everywhere.
Well, because all of a sudden he looks good by comparison, I imagine. Because this administration has managed to surpass the level of malfeasance that he attained. And also because this is a very forgiving and sentimental culture.
No, I don't think it's the question of the culture being forgiving. Rather, it's the press, which loves to destroy and then build up again in order to destroy at a later date. Nixon, of course, is quoted widely because he has something to say, and he's one of the most astute politicians of our century. He continues to follow everything very closely, and he has something to contribute. I mean, most politicians nowadays do not. He does.
I think that the price for having him back and sort of rehabilitated, which is what seems to be happening, ought to be that he removes the lock that he maintains personally on a whole section of the presidential archives of his period, and opens those to historians, ceases to contest that in the courts.
Let me add one...
And gives an honest interview about the motive for the Watergate burglary. Then I think, things could be put on a fair footing again.
This is the Wall Street Journal for Monday. It's David Shribman's piece about Bob Dole, how Dole squandered money, opportunities, dooming hopes for 88. And it leads off here as Robert Dole watched each of the 17 Super Tuesday political contests slip from his grip last Tuesday evening. A telegram arrived at his third-floor suite. Richard Nixon was urging him to fight on. Any reaction?
Well, Nixon still wants to see a race. Nixon may think that if Bush wins early on, it's bad for the Republican Party, in that it won't force Bush to sharpen his views, to display more leadership, to develop sounder reasons for describing why he wants to be president. I mean, that's the main question about Bush so far. No one really knows why it is he wants to be president other than perhaps out of a sense of duty.
Chris?
Sense of duty. No, I think that's right, actually. I think Nixon does want there to be a race. And for as long as there's a race, ex-presidents and ex-leaders of the Republican Party are in demand as advisors and consultants.
Speaking of a race, here is the front page of the Washington Times. And the headline on this story, home folks in Tennessee vouch for Gore's roots. And you can see here, this is Carthage, Tennessee. And here are two people. This is a beauty shop. You can see the picture of them. Reaction from both of you to Senator Gore.
I think he's the least qualified of all the Democratic candidates. He's not even, he's still wet behind the ears, as they say. He's almost an invention of the New Republics. He's waffled on issues probably as much as Gephardt and gotten away with it. And just personally, he does not seem to project a charismatic kind of sound leader. He's sort of, I think Chris Hitchens would probably have a field day describing Gore's kind of little rich boy image.
Well, I'd feel a bit pompous calling him wet behind the ears, since he's about the same age as I am. But I think I agree with what you say about him being candidate of the New Republic, which I think is a deplorable thing to have to be. I also think that it's one thing to notice as a politician that there's some space on the right, as there is in the Democratic race at the moment, but then to move to occupy it by pretending to hold positions you never held until you noticed that space is contemptible, and probably can be seen through even by people who are going to be impressed by the other half of his argument, which is this firm belief that he comes from Tennessee, which is something that I don't deny him. If he wants to claim that, he's welcome.
Why
there's such a big effort made to sort of prove and establish this is something that I don't understand.
Why do the polls out of Chicago show that he's got about 3% of the vote going into the primary?
Because that reflects his popularity in the North. And Mr. Hitchens doesn't understand why Gore is trying to establish a Southern kind of an image of himself as a Southerner. And that's simply because the South for the Democrats is very critical. Without winning the South, they can't win the presidency. And he needs a gimmick, something that will separate him from the rest of the pack. So he wants to run as a Southerner. It's very understandable. But again, in the North, he has no real support. He no name recognition. He's very young. He may be running for future races. He wants to establish himself now as a national figure, and maybe in 4 or 8 years he'll be a little more qualified.
In the commentary section of the Washington Times this morning, Pat Buchanan writes a column that's nationally syndicated, and the headline is, "Should the right take a walk?" And let me read this paragraph right here. Frustrated, bitter at their failure to unite and stop the moderates' recapture of the party, conservatives are muttering, "Let's let this one out. Let's let the Democrats have it all. When they foul up, as they did under President Carter, we will come back stronger than ever in 90 and 92, maybe even taking the House. Let's let Michael Dukakis' crowd be lollygagging in the barnyard when the chickens come home to roost."
I can see why the right is talking like that.
Pat, by the way, Pat Buchanan says, while not inaccurate as cold-blooded analysis, the sentiment is more than a little cynical. This would be true dog-in-the-manger politics, Nelson Rockefeller style, and the stakes are too large for such pettiness now.
That's boilerplate, of course. I mean, the meat of the piece is in the suggestion that the Republicans have no further claim on the loyalty of the movement right, which is probably true, but I mean, it's hard to be sympathetic to them. They were the last significant political group in the country to notice what was obvious to the rest of us from the start, which is that Ronald Reagan is a fraud. And now they realize that he didn't mean a word he really said, that he let down even his dearest friends, broke every promise he'd made even in that quarter, and they're sort of appalled and hurt and upset, and I just think it's delightful.
Well, to call Ronald Reagan a fraud is, again, something we all like to hear from people like Christopher Hitchens. I mean, would that all Republican frauds had 2 consecutive, on the whole, highly successful terms in which the president is extremely popular, and thanks to that popularity, his vice president emerges as the front runner for the Republican nomination. His policies, in the larger sense, have been very successful. This is one reason probably why conservatives